Hey, how you doing? This is Coach Fleischer. This is Kinesiology 214, and today we'll be going through this presentation and going over uh, program design, but more specific to one of the main periodization models that's found in the industry. And this model is a little bit more specific to sport conditioning, but it's very applicable to the general population. It's one that I use with my clients on a regular basis to go ahead and program out workouts over a much bigger picture. And the model itself to the right here, it's kind of this ascending or cake-shaped kind of model as it's referred to. It starts off with a hypertrophy phase on the bottom of the pyramid, and then that sets the foundation for the base strength, power, peaking. And the way this works is you usually do this over a larger, much bigger picture, maybe a year, perhaps a couple years type of programming. You can even use this as part of a mesocycle, and we'll talk a little bit more about micro, meso, and macro cycles, but kind of an in-between phase. So you might, for example, see an off-season training program where athletes start off in a high volume phase and progress to lower volume over time, with lower intensity progressing to higher intensity over time. If you're somebody who has participated in swimming, wrestling, running, this peaking phase has an event-driven component to it. You'll often hear runners or swimmers talk about tapering once they get to this phase so then they can peak for an event, say like regionals, nationals, etc. This can also be done when you look at this in terms of a 12-week training program where you start that a mesocycle and you start off with a higher volume phase, and as you go through, you drive your athletes towards perhaps a 1-rep test for a max attempt. So you have this kind of training program, or the training maxes like we talked about before, but you're driving your athletes towards a 1-rep attempt 12 weeks out. Could be 8 weeks, but usually this is a 12-week cycle you'll see in here. And it progresses rather quickly. And you'll see an 8-week version of this in a linear progression phase later on in this presentation. But the concept is, as you go through this, and we'll talk a lot about this in this class, you're going from general to specific, from simple on the bottom to more complex. You have a higher volume phase at the bottom and lower volume phase towards the top, lower intensity at the bottom and higher intensity up top. And so the specificity comes into play, and it kind of makes sense, right? If you're in a preseason phase and you start off in this hypertrophy phase and you do higher volume training and it's more generalized, when you get closer and closer to your sport, for example, and you go to the in-season phase of training, that specificity comes into play, because if you think about it, if you start practicing tennis for the season, it doesn't get more specific than actually playing tennis, right? Down here you can do things that'll help you play better tennis, but here when you get into this phase and you're in that in-season phase, you are literally practicing your sport and you're supplementing with other exercises. So general to specific, simple to complex, higher volume to lower volume, and lower intensity to higher intensity. Those are monikers I live by all day long. This is not, however, just I want to point this out, not done over a 1-week type of training cycle. So, for example, you won't take somebody with high volume on a Monday or a Sunday after a football game on Saturday and then have them do heavy singles and doubles on a Thursday before they play a game on Friday. So this is generally seen in a bigger picture phase, and that will probably be a test question somewhere out there later on. I tried to break this down and make it a little bit easier to understand, and I put the different phases across the top here. So there's your base hypertrophy phase, base strength, power, peaking across the top. And I tried to lay this out in terms of a larger competitive or calendar cycle. So you have the early off-season training where you're just establishing volume. You have this middle off-season training where you get a little bit more base strength. Then you go into late off-season to early preseason to in-season, and then you would peak for a particular competitive event or competitive season. Higher volume to the left, lower intensity to the left, lower volume here, higher intensity over here, more generalized movement patterns over here, more specific movement patterns over here. And then simple movement patterns and complex movement patterns here. I do sometimes, though, as a coach, I will regress my athletes back into more generalized and more simple movement patterns as a way to kind of refresh, if you will, and back off some of the rigors of training, but also just to reestablish movement patterns that maybe get lost in translation as you work towards being more specific over a competitive season. You know, there's a coaching component where you have a psychological, emotional component. There's a grind, kind of like that trough of the season where it gets to be a grind to go to practice every day. And you have to find ways to adjust the stimuli you're placing on your athletes to get a training response, even in season. So there are times when I will, even in the in-season phase, in that peaking phase or late power phase, I'll bring my athletes occasionally back out to more generalized movements and simple movement patterns just to kind of reinforce these movement patterns so they translate back into the specific and more complex movement patterns and are able to do these more effectively. Just a food for thought for you. Now, this model, when you look at it, you know, so often I see newer trainers come in and they work with their clients and they do 3 sets of 15 on everything. And clients, they get great results to start off because they weren't doing anything before and their body adapts to the stressor placed upon it as per general adaptation syndrome. But it is incredibly boring for the client and also for the trainer. But it's almost like, you know, your client eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they're eating oatmeal and the body just gets bored. And one of the easiest ways, other than changing exercise selection, is changing the rep and set combinations. And you can progress and regress your clients over time, back and forth, up and down this model. Quite honestly, you could do over a 2-month cycle with your clients, you can start them off in higher volume and bring them to lower volume and start off with lower weight and go to higher weight. You can have more specific movement patterns if perhaps they're a tennis player. You get to know that person, and really that's what happens during the first couple of weeks of training. I mean, you're just kind of still in the honeymoon phase and getting to know your clients, and they're getting to know you, and you're figuring out what they can and can't do. And it doesn't happen on the first intake. You wish it did, right? But you got to get your hands on your clients to really get a feel of what they can and can't do. And that takes a little bit of time. And this is where you can just use a base hypertrophy phase here before you even progress them into more specific type of training. And I say that because there's a little bit of a trust factor, and we'll talk about this later on, that's built between you and your client, and a relationship building process that happens early on in a training cycle. And as you get to know them and they get to know you, then the trust starts to ramp up, and then you can throw more stuff at them. So when you work with folks from the general population, I urge you to work on different rep and set combinations. It could be as simple as 2 sets of 15 the first week, 3 sets of 15 the next week, 2 sets of 15, 1 set of 12 the week after that. I mean, you can mix and match and get creative with this, and you're only limited by your own creativity. And believe me, your clients will appreciate it, and your business will benefit because your clients will stick around because they will see results, and that boredom will be eliminated. Okay, so we're going to take a few moments here to kind of tie a few things together from previous lectures. We're also going to kind of foreshadow, which is a teaching tool, and I hope you say, man, that guy was really good about foreshadowing some stuff coming up. But we're going to foreshadow a few things as well regarding working out and program design. And on the next slide, we'll have an 8-week linear periodization program. By linear, that means your reps are just that, linear. You're not undulating the rep and set combinations. It's staying pretty straightforward, and that's a training tool you can use. You don't have to do 3 sets or 2 sets for every workout. There's times where you can do 4, there's times where you can do 3, times you can do 2, but in this example you'll see it's pretty straightforward and pretty linear, and I do that specifically to eliminate the possibility of us getting confused in the process. But believe me, you're only limited by your own creativity, and once you have the science of general adaptation syndrome and actually periodization models kind of in your head rolling around, you can do this week to week and really take your clients through different training programs week to week to week and find different challenges for them. And we'll talk more about that in about 2 more presentations when we get into macro, meso, and micro cycles in terms of ways to lay out programs. All right, guys, you ready? So here we go. I brought over the slide from the conversation we had regarding reps, set volumes, and percentages, and I mapped it out and I flipped it, right? So before it was 1, 2, 3, 4, and I put the lower reps on the bottom, so it went from ascending to descending. Now we're descending to ascending. With this, you have week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6, week 7, week 8. So you have an 8-week program with week 1 on the bottom. I left the weeks off because it looked kind of confusing, I'll have to admit. But week 1, you're doing reps of 10, reps of 8, 6. So each set, you're doing a set of 5, a set of 4, a set of 3, a set of 2, a set of 1 reps. We're doing 4 sets for each. So if you calculate that out, 4 times 10 is 40. Your total workout is 40 reps. All right, got it. And then when you get to here in week number 8, you're doing 4 sets of 1. That's 4 reps. brought over the coefficient conversation. If you remember that from before, we held it at 0.03, and that Epley formula actually is a sliding scale and it gets a little bit tighter when you get into 1. But for the sake of this class, we had two things that we said. One of which was it's 0.03 per rep, and then you know if you're doing sets of 10, you're at 70%. You just know that because coefficient 0.3 minus 1 is 70%. We did that in a previous presentation. You got it. You got yourself wrapped around it, no problem. But notice what happens with this. And we put this side by side so you can juxtaposition these two. You have this base strength kind of hypertrophy phase down here where it's higher volume. As you progress through and you go towards the peaking phase, it's lower volume. And that's total volume, right? Because we kept the sets the same. We just dropped the amount of reps we did per set. And so over time, we went from 40 reps overall for an exercise down to 4. Well, you know if you're doing less reps, that coefficient changes, and that also changes the percentage workload that you're working at. So the converse of that is we went from a lower intensity in the base and hypertrophy phase up in the peaking phase to a higher intensity. This is the classic model. Again, like I mentioned in the first couple slides, you go from high volume to low volume, low intensity to high intensity, and in this phase, outside of just the methodology of the rep and set combinations, you would have different exercise selection to make this a workout or make the workouts more specific to what you're doing with your client. And if perhaps they're training for tennis, you might not see too much in terms of tennis down in here. But as you go through here, as you get from general to specific and simple to more complex, and you'll see this in another video, you're talking about doing much, much more specific work up here as you tie in with more explosive work in here. Now granted, your loading parameters that you'll use for different sports will differ from this, but this is just for sake of conversation. If you compare the cake model to something you're familiar with in terms of reps, sets, and percentages, you can see in the hypertrophy phase to the peaking phase how it changes from a lower intensity to a higher intensity and a higher volume to a lower volume. You got it, guys? So this begs the question. It's one that's you just have to wrap yourself around in this industry, and it's one like strength coaches can sit around and talk for hours about. So if I'm a guy that benches 200 pounds for my max and I'm at 88%, well, I'm doing 176 pounds per rep, right? So 176 pounds at 4 reps would yield 704 pounds, okay? Well, 4 sets of 1 would yield 776. If I'm doing 3 sets of 10, is my 3 sets of 10 at 70% or 140 pounds? Is that going to give me a higher total tonnage? Well, yeah, of course it will. So the question you have at this point, and this is more philosophical and food for thought. I'm not asking you guys to solve anything. Just kind of sit back in your chair and go, what is more difficult? Think it through. Is sets of 10 more difficult? 4 sets of 10 more difficult? 4 sets of 1 more difficult? And when you're training at an appropriate percentage, it kind of becomes a relative play, right? It's kind of relative to the person, the body weight. Think back to Antoine Thrift and Sully. You know, those guys like Antoine, pound for pound, was unbelievably strong. So every workout he had, pound for pound, he was moving a lot of weight per pound of body weight or per kilogram of body weight. And so you have to kind of weigh this out in terms of what kind of workload are you placing on your athletes. And you'll find that with your clients and your athletes, the more in shape they are, you have to do things that require you as a coach or a trainer to be a little bit more proactive. It's not just straight 3 sets of 15 all the way through. You're going to crush your people. You have to undulate the training and undulate the workloads. And that's really what periodization is. It's the scientific manipulation of rep and set combinations to elicit the maximal training response while minimizing the deleterious or negative effects of training, of overtraining, injuries, psychological, emotional, overtraining kind of mindset. You know, that's what you're after with periodization and proper program design, but it requires you to be a little bit proactive on the front end, not just coming in and saying, okay, Mrs. Smith, we're going to do 3 sets of 15, do some tennis drills. No. You know, to really get your game on here, you have to be good at kind of mapping this stuff out. All right, so hopefully in the next couple presentations, that'll clear a few things up for you in terms of tonnage and what's hard and what's not hard, what's a tough workout and what's an easy workout. But with this, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for today and let you guys kind of stew a little bit and move on to the next presentation. Signing out.